Stephen, other than seeing you in a tie, which is always so nice, tell us why we're here. I mean, for me, what was exciting about this is the ability to have that intersection of the arts meets technology, meets Shoah, meets education. But tell us why we're here.
Well, first to the tie, because he's right. I showed up from the UK 10 years ago, still in my suit and tie, and was very eager to shed it. But anyway, I went to a meeting in Brentwood in the first probably 6 months of being here, and I put on my really nice silver tie with the black stripes on it. It was actually my best tie because I was going to meet somebody very special. It actually goes back, it relates to this interview, to this place really closely, and to the film Schindler's List. Because there was a young boy who was deported from Croatia, from Zagreb, to Auschwitz. He was 9 years old at the time. A very young survivor of the concentration camp. Survived, went back to Croatia, and during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when films were being made about the Second World War, including Band of Brothers and those sort of movies, where you couldn't film in the Soviet Union where the events took place, Croatia was an ideal location. So this gentleman figured out how to be a producer of Second World War movies. Went on to become a producer then of some Hollywood blockbusters, including Gladiator, for which he was decorated. And I was getting to meet this gentleman because, unusually for him, he showed up in Hollywood, wanted to find his way around town, and managed to get a meeting with Steven Spielberg. And at the time, Steven was considering making Schindler's List. And this Holocaust survivor producer was sitting in his office talking to him, and he said to him, would you take a look at this script for me? And Branko Lustig, his name was, said, you know, don't need to do that because I already reviewed it, I already know what the budget is for the film. So he went in there for an informal meeting with Steven Spielberg and came out as a producer of Schindler's List, and was one of the 3 producers on the movie. Most people don't know that one of the producers on Schindler's List was a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. So I went to meet Branko, and I got here because I was excited to meet this producer, Holocaust survivor. So I got into, I think it was in La Panne in Brentwood somewhere. I sit down, and the first thing he said to me was, give me your tie. Before he even said hello, give me your tie. I said, hi. Well, I said, okay. I said, I'm only going to take your tie. I'm only going to give you my tie if I can have yours. He said, well, you know, we're European. We know what it means at the end of a soccer match to swap shirts. Before we start, we're going to swap ties. Branko Lustig passed away on Saturday, and this is his tie.
So this is part of what I love about Stephen. He brings human life and emotion to the work that he does. So, Steve, tell us about, this is a great audience. We have scholars here, we have educators, we have people who are influentials both in the community and around the country. And I think when I got a note back, and we want to keep this to be a pretty intimate discussion, but I think it was Eileen or someone said, I love knowing more about storytelling, finding the tools that are working. Tell us about what we saw in the other room, Dimensions and Testimony. Tell us about Eyewitness. Tell us about storytelling, not just in terms of understanding the past, but what we're doing for the students now and to the students of the future.
Well, there's been a lot of concern, about the fact that we have a generation of people, like the people sitting behind me, that today are, passing. And we've been thinking about what does it mean to live in a world where the witnesses of the Holocaust who've been so present in our lives, telling the story and making it really personal to us, will not be there in person in future. I am very aware, because of the work of the Shoah Foundation, that to talk about that is premature because these individuals are living members of our community who have got a great deal to offer us and continue to offer a great deal to us in terms of insights from that particular period in history, but also insights into who we are in our society today. Sorry, I'm dropping my microphone. You know, this gallery and what we're seeing here today is sort of the epitome of that moment in time. David Cassan, the artist here, is painting living survivors. So everybody that you see depicted in this gallery was alive at the point at which he started the project 3 years ago. I think 3 of them have now passed. So that's a part of that sort of moving of history. You saw in the other gallery there the interactive testimony. I'll speak a bit more in depth in a moment. But that's also a project where we've interviewed 22 people in this interactive way, of whom 3 have now passed. And it was an interesting moment in time, about last April time. I was at a conference in Oxford, and we were sharing this project with colleagues, mainly from the not-for-profit sector. We were at something called the Skull Forum. And we were there with, philanthropic, not-for-profit leaders, and thinking about how do we tell stories from our past. And it was, I think, coincidental, but it was during that conference that the first of our interviewees passed away. His name was Aaron Elster. Aaron was a very young and lively and fit 84-year-old. He was not what we would have considered, the individual who would have gone first. So it came as a big surprise. He passed away very suddenly. And I got the text that evening to say that this had happened. The next morning, I went into the conference. We had a little booth, and people would come in and out throughout the day and experience engaging with the interview. And I sat there with the computer, and at that point, we had 15 interviews. I had all of them on my computer, and I chose to put Aaron on the screen. Just because I wanted to see him, I guess. And then I realized, gosh, I'm going to be the first person in history to talk to a hologram of a person who's passed away. I'd been involved in his interview, and I knew him well, but it was still a very strange moment. So I pressed the button to interview him, and I just came out of my mouth, Aaron, what do you want your legacy to be? And he said, I want young people to hear my stories so that they understand that in life you can't decide what's going to happen to you. You have no control over that. Some things go really well and some things go really badly. But whatever it is, I want them to know that if you can be resilient and you can stick through it and you can keep your values, it's worth it. And that's what I want them to take out of this. And suddenly he gave me this permission, in a way, to just keep asking questions. So throughout that day, I left Aaron on the interview on the screen, and people came in and out and talked to him for the next 6 hours. He'd not yet been buried. And I was able to get in touch with his son and say, look, I'm sorry I can't get to the funeral, but I want you to know your dad had a really fabulous day. And it's been very, very interesting, Alan, because we decided very clearly we were not going to put technology in front of stories or people's lives, but that we wanted to use technology in service of their lives. And while there's a lot of academic debate about holograms, yes or no, representations, yes or no, is this a gimmick, is this a gadget, what is it? What we know is that if we're in service of history and we're in service of their lives and their values, ultimately what we produce with them and not of them allows them to tell the story in the way they want to tell it. So I think that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to find different ways. David Cassan has used an ancient and well-respected technique to be able to depict the human form. And as he says himself, and as we recognize here, with our colleagues at the Fisher Museum, that when you paint something, it doesn't go in the trash. It's not disposable. It's not dispensable. It's something which is eternal and immortal in some ways. And I think David's used that art form in order to immortalize these individuals. And yet, David Cassan himself is a digital native. What's wonderful about this is I discovered him on Instagram because he's in his late 30s. He FaceTimes his sessions in the studio and, just Facebook Live and whatever, so that people can experience him actually, the art form itself. So he's using technology to explain his process. And at the same time, as soon as I saw his first piece, I realized, without knowing him or his method, this is testimony. I couldn't understand how that piece that's just out there could have such, working with so many Holocaust survivors as I do, communicate so much in a painting. And so when I did get to speak to him, which actually was with Selma Hollow, who's the director here at the Fisher Museum, and John Nava, who did the beautiful tapestry in the Tudor Center, one of our local LA artists, and myself met David Cassan here on campus a couple of years ago. And then he told me his process, and his process is to sit down with the survivors, not to do a painting sitting, but he interviews them, he photographs them, he goes to their home, he gets inside their lives, and he literally listens to their Shoah Foundation testimonies as he paints. So the testimony and the art, sort of the narrative and the art go together, and it's kind of an extension of it, and that's why being here is wonderful.
It's interesting when you're talking about the arts meets technology meets education. So much of education for a couple hundred years has been flat, one-dimensional. I see my mother here, 95 years young. We have a, yay! And I think of our family history. So her family in a place in Europe, if you look at the map books in 1943, there's an area outside of Lipnischutz, which is there, and then in 1945, it's not in the map books. It's literally not in the map books. But that is a flat statement, right? And what you've been able to do with both Eyewitness, which is a whole curriculum platform, has been extraordinary. And I need to share something again, like there are some news folks here, but this one will please stay in the room. But I think instructive for this audience. Last year I did some work with Parkland students. And Stephen will share the story. I'll share the coda of my impressions in terms of what I think the outcomes were. But share, Stephen, with this audience, Parkland, Ivy, Darren, and the role that Shoah is playing in students' lives, and then I'll give my opinion on the impact.
So the Shoah Foundation, as you know, has 55,000 testimonies. It's 113,000 hours of material. So if we were to sit and watch the archive from end to end, we'd have to sit here for 13 and a half years, 24 hours a day, and not move. If we were to employ a USC student next May on graduation, and we said to this young lady, welcome to your new job, I'd like you to sit and watch the archive every day of your working life, and just come back and tell me when you're done. The 22-year-old will be 75 years old when she comes back and says, what do you want me to do next? It's literally a lifetime of testimony. Now, when you give testimony in this archive, you don't just, it's about 2 hours and 10 minutes on average. So if you think about it, if you'd been living for 6 years under Nazi occupation, or maybe you were 9 years old in Berlin in 1933, and then come 1945, you're in your early 20s, and you've been through 12 years. Maybe you were stateless for another 2 years after that. It could be a 15-year story, and you're going to compact that down into 2 hours-ish. You choose your words really carefully. So it isn't just 113,000 hours of kind of rambling on. It's 113,000 hours of the most carefully chosen words human beings can find. So we have that archive. We share that with about 160 universities around the world, including USC. But we also share this with students in high school. Well, actually, from grade 2 onwards, we have programs for grade 2. Through to teaching in graduate education. And we have a platform for that called Eyewitness. Eyewitness just has only 3,000 of the 55,000, which is only 6,000 hours of content for school children to use, which is probably the largest visual archive they will ever get to use in school by a long way. But we put this into small activities. And those activities relate to particular curricula that might be in a state or a country. It might relate to a particular curriculum produced by an organization, like, for example, Southern Poverty Law, or the United States Holocaust Museum, or Facing History, or one of those. And it becomes a complement to the written and printed text. Hence, getting it off the paper, off the page. And we don't just transfer that online, we actually create content for the digital media. It's a digital platform. All of that to say, on the 14th of February last year, when news was coming in that there was a shooting happening in a school in Florida, one of my colleagues walked out of the office over in Levy Library and said to me, you know, we have over 850 students that are registered at that school. Now, at that point, there was no news on the casualties, only that there was a shooting. And it occurred to me straight away, I don't think we have any school that I know of that's got 800 students in one school registered on the platform. We have 150,000 users and 2.5 million students a year use it, but that wasn't the point. The point was that school was obviously committed to having students registered, not just teachers. And it was very clear that if that was the case, that we might see casualties of a program that we've been running in that school with a teacher that was on the Shoah Foundation's Education Curriculum Committee. I gave her a couple of days and I called Ivy, and I'd heard on the news that one of the students said, I was in my Holocaust class when the gunman came up. What I didn't know at that time, that class was on the Shoah Foundation's Eyewitness site, and they were working on one of our programs. In Eyewitness, there's a program on the Olympics. It looks at the 1936 Olympics and looks at the issue of race and sport, or race hatred and sport. They were studying that because it was the Winter Olympics that week. And so Ivy thought, the teacher, that would be a good segue for the students. During that class, one of the students, his name was Nick Dworet, was talking about the fact that he'd just been recruited to the Indiana swim team. And he was talking about a story from Annapolis where a student, high school student athletics group, one of their fellow students had been shot in a gang, whatever, shooting in the community. And so the student athletes decided they were going to go help set up a program which they called From Hood to Good. And he was talking about this, and he heard it, he found it inspiring, and he said that when I get to Indiana, I'm going to get involved in something like that. I want to be involved in the community, use my influence, and work with fellow athletes on promoting diversity and working together. 30 seconds later, Nick Dworet was dead. It was literally the last thing he said. He was sitting just inside the door of that class, and sitting next to him was Matt, and next to Matt was Helena. And Helena and Matt were the first two people that were killed in that shooting. Helena and Nick were the first two people who were killed. Matt, who was sitting in between them, said to me, I was sitting there with my Eyewitness screen open, and all I remember was I grabbed my video because I heard this pop, 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 and he was the kid that filmed the gunman with his literally over his shoulder. And he said, then a bullet went through my screen. He said, so then I realized it was serious, and I dropped to the floor with Nick and Helena, and when it was all over, I got up and they didn't. And he said, what really struck me was, in that classroom, right at that moment, we were talking about the consequences of hate, and we didn't realize just how close it is to any of us at any time. I spoke to Ivy, again, probably about 2 weeks later. These young people had got involved in this program and they were starting to develop the March for Our Lives program. And I said to her, Ivy, are you surprised by the way that your students are reacting? Because it's the students from that class that she and Darren shared that were the ones that were leading March for Our Lives. All the young people that you saw on that podium has done that class. And she said, absolutely not. And I said, why is that? She said, well, we don't spend a year talking about what the consequences of the Holocaust and genocide are for our students to sit and do nothing. The whole point is that we learn to be active in our society, and had they not done something, I would have been surprised and disappointed. The fact that they are feels to me like they understood what we were trying to get across. It's a long way of saying...
No, and again, I felt it, and Liz was here with me in San Diego when I spent time with those students. And there was an added piece that I found extraordinary, that understanding history in that kind of contextual framework gave them an added understanding of resilience. And for those students, and again, you can't, for so many students, there have been so many hard stories. There have been some suicides, and these students have dealt with so much. But for those students that were part of those classes, I've spent days with them. They were able to contextualize it. They were able to think about resilience. They were able to understand they had thought about hate and thought about ramifications. And in a sick, perverse way, in a world that is sometimes spiraling out of control, they were as ready as you could be because of the lessons that had been conveyed through Eyewitness. And I thought that was really important. And so an example of real life, of taking content, taking platforms, and making it relevant to students. I promised everyone here that we would make this an interactive discussion. So we have some extraordinary scholars here, and I see Daphne and Norbert, and I've got Jeff and others. So much about today, I wax on ineloquently that we don't have education problems, that we have communications problems. If Stephen calls me on the weekend and says, someone needs to know about the best third grade reading program, I can give him what those 2 or 3 best programs are, and based off of research, what works. And Zoe knows that stuff, and folks from the School of Ed here know that. Or 8th grade math, I can cite that. And then the logical question is, so why isn't everyone using it? And I always say, well, it's a communications problem. And there are politics with that, and there's all sorts of, but it's a communications problem in terms of education. So I like to open it up to questions, but I like Norbert, Daphne, Jeff, others, when you see this, when you see arts meets technology meets education, and you think about it in a world that is, and he who shall remain nameless, things that are going on in Washington, and hate is so deep, and social media, the speed in which social media is impacting the young ones, the old ones, everyone. I want to have a series of questions first, mostly Stephen, and in terms of what you see in terms of that.
One thing about this powerful story is that though it's truly live at a moment in time which is so polarized, this story is eternal. And wherever you are on the spectrum politically, if it's taken out of this moment, it's relevant. And that's why you're March for Relevant. By the way, my wife is on the board of March for Relevant.
And I didn't know that story. That story explains so much to me about the power of these students and their focus and their energy and their passion for changing the system, which teaches all of us older people on the board, because the board is half students and half people who were involved in philanthropy and nonprofits. That story it was like a light bulb that went on in my head, saying, of course, this is that passion that had to come from some educated place, and it does, as your story points out. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing that, and for the work that you do. I think I had the privilege of being there on the march that day with the Stoneman Douglas school students, and we got stuck at the far end of 500,000 people and had to figure out how to get ourselves to the stage, because I was with the students that were not on the stage. So they thought they were going to have a pathway all the way through. And it was the most moving experience to be with them as they walked through that crowd, and people realized that the kids that were trying to get past them were from the school, and seeing the gratitude being expressed by a general population that had shown up was probably the most moving part of the whole experience. And although it was a difficult 45 minutes getting through 500,000 people, it turned out to be a very heartwarming one, because we actually saw what people were really saying, were really thinking, were really feeling, and it gave a really important sort of insight, I think, to that moment in time. And to your point as well, Jeff, you're right that the Holocaust and its meaning for humanity will be one that will go on for, centuries to come. Part of the effort of the Shoah Foundation is to ensure that we do preserve this archive so those lessons continue to be learned, or at least to be found. I'll go a little bit further. There's a Holocaust survivor I was speaking to in Phoenix, whose name will come back to me in just a moment. And she said to me, we haven't yet formulated the questions that we really need to ask, and it won't happen in our lifetime, because I think, she said, we're going to be too close to this for some time to come to be able to really understand what does this mean. And I really appreciated her saying that, because Part of our work is to ask those questions, which is why we do these projects, is to try and get to the bottom of what we think the questions are. But in a sense, our duty at this point in time is just to ensure, at the very least, that we pass this on to the next generation in a way that they can then continue to ask those questions, and the generation after that, and the generation, because we're going to have to keep asking questions for a very long time to come.
Just before Eva, I wanted to bring in again, and want to get to Eva in a second, but again, this is a wonderful example of having some extraordinary interdisciplinary abilities. So we have Dornsife, we have the Price School of Public Policy in the house, we have cinematic arts, we have Annenberg. Jeff is the former dean and university professor. Daphne and Norbert, they think a lot about, so much about what Shoah does is about understanding history, but also about changing people's minds. And I was wondering, any thoughts as we're talking about this today?
My first thought was, how do you get to talk to people who are not yet open to the idea?
Yeah, great question.
What's your experience? I mean, my guess would be that most people who come in are probably the people who least need to come in, and the people who would most need to come in probably don't even look at the act.
Fantastic. Are you volunteering to join our committee on this? Because this is actually such a great question. We've just been doing a little bit of a review of our YouTube site, which we've put very little effort into, I have to say. Good news is, without trying, we've got 81 million minutes of viewing a year, 211,000 minutes of viewing today. People are viewing the archive. Great news. Bad news, they're all over 45, and most of them are connected to the history in some way, from what we can tell. So, to your very point, the people that are most connected are the ones that are most engaging with the content, which is great. We want them to do that. But we want absolutely to get to the generation and the groups that maybe are demographically and geographically, not least associated. So we are doing some things that are very purposeful to get us ready to be able to do that. So, for example, we say, okay, there's 1 billion plus people in China. How are we going to reach them? Probably not actually with accented Hungarians talking about what happened in the Second World War. What we actually need is folks that are speaking Mandarin talking about what happened in that part of the world at the time. So we went and we interviewed all living survivors of the Nanjing massacre. There were 102. We interviewed them all. Because you have to start from the point at which your population that you're trying to reach has the cultural, linguistic, and historical point of contact. And then from there, the method is then you start to expand that to look at other things that can start to change their mind. Another example of the type of work we've done in this way, where we've been, let's just say we've been testing the waters on how to go about this. In Rwanda, we've taken testimony and we work with an organization called the Aegis Trust, which is part of the Kigali Genocide Memorial, which is the National Genocide Museum there. So they've taken some testimony, and we've helped them with some of that work, and we now have that in Shoah Foundation's archive. So you would think that the testimonies from Rwanda would be the perfect ones to teach in the schools in Rwanda, except not. Because when you're in a classroom in Rwanda, it's 25 years ago, the children in the classrooms, parents are perpetrators, survivors, returning refugees. They represent all of the different sides of the conflict. And so when you talk about that conflict in that classroom, it's about what his mother or his uncle or grandparent did 25 years ago. So in fact, in Rwanda, we start with teaching the Holocaust. Because it's not their experience. You can talk about it safely because it happened 75 years ago in Europe, but you can start to build the language with which then to break down those barriers. Then you can safely transition after several weeks to say, now let's talk about that in the context of our own country, because they need to know it didn't only happen there. They need to see it from a universal perspective before they can see it from a personal perspective. Final example. Hungary is is well known right now for being one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world. It's also the fastest growing program of the Shoah Foundation by a very long way. We have over 10% penetration in Hungarian schools. We're on the national curriculum, and we're in all state universities and all state libraries. And the reason for that is what we wanted to figure out, how do we change the minds of the leaders? Because if you can change the minds of the leaders, then you can get to the young people. And so our method there has been to do that, and the anti-Semitic government of Hungary is our funder and our sponsor and our main supporter in bringing Holocaust education to Hungary. So part of it is we're trying to work out, and this is why I invite you to come and spend more time with us, we're trying to find out what are the mechanisms, who are the people that we need to take on this journey of change to be effective, and we haven't really worked out a scalable model yet.
And your assumption is that probably not that you can change the mind of the Hungarian government, but that by them helping you get into schools you can change
Correct.
something for the next generation, accepting that you're kind of serving as a big lead for the government.
Right, and in fact our main way of working with the Hungarian government is through digital literacy, because we have a digital platform in Hungarian that meets some of their curricular needs. And so actually we are a win for them. And the fact that we're helping them to then change and get into classrooms where we can address directly the issue of anti-Semitism is where we get the long-term win. I would love to talk to you more.
So Eva, who is both, we talked about influentials, and she's a social worker, and she's a kindred spirit. Eva?
I love Edge. Just saying. Center Edge. This is really piggybacking and consistent. With all that is going on, why is anti-Semitism on the rise?
Well, if you want to know more about that, we're going to be doing a series with The Conversation here at USC, which is going to be called Why Do People Hate the Jews? Inspired by James Arkatov, who sat in our offices 2 years ago and said, I just want to know why. You remember the conversation, Salome? Why? So, there's been a lot of writing recently about who, what, where, when. There's been some great publications recently. Deborah Lipstadt's book's great. Barry Weiss's book on how to fight anti-Semitism, just out recently, excellent. Still doesn't get to the why. And that's really troubling, because if we don't know the causes, then we aren't going to find solutions to that. Now, I don't think for a moment that a 2-day, 6-paper symposium that then gets published is going to help solve what has been a millennial question or a multi-millennial question now. But I think it's our duty as researchers to try and look at causes. Because right now we're seeing a lot of impacts, we're seeing a lot of effects, we're seeing a lot of consequences. But I think the Jewish community, with very good reason, is extremely scared of what is being seen and being experienced by Jews all over the world, including here in the United States of America. I think we, as an Englishman, I used to run in a National Holocaust Center in the UK and the National Holocaust Memorial Day. I sat in on all the meetings about anti-Semitism and knew very well the gentleman who ran the all-party group on countering anti-Semitism 10 years ago. His name was John Mann, who just resigned 2 weeks ago out of pure frustration and simply said, I can't do this another day. So I didn't think, honestly, I didn't think I would see the United Kingdom as in the state it's in right now. We have a lot to worry about. But what I see in my daily life and daily work is just how many people are working on that and are willing to put their time and their money and their resources and their effort and their skills and their expertise and their teaching into that. I think to the point of the previous question, Norbert, we've got to find out what the right mechanisms are, though. Because I think what I see is a lot of flailing around and desperation. We decided at the Shoah Foundation, we're going to stop reacting. We don't react now at all to hatred in the media, period. And we decided that because we decided we're actually not going to be dictated to by haters, first of all. Secondly, I've got better things to do with my day, and we've got to think about the long term. And if we spend all of our time and all of our day reacting to what's happening in the latest cycle, then all we're doing is we're being led by the people that are actually bringing our values down. And what we want to do is invest in investing in our values and bringing them up. I have to say, having decided to do that and really focus our organization, part of our organization here at USC on that, already we're seeing, I think, much better return on our investment in terms of just engaging with more partners, finding where those alliances are, looking for them in the most unusual places, and ensuring that we're not just partnering in an echo chamber with people that think the same things that we think, but trying to get into those communities and parts of the world that are perhaps need some change, or where we can find alliances that are going to be more productive. So for example, let me give you an example. I'm a UNESCO chair on genocide education. I get lobbied every single day to resign my position by some member of the Jewish community because they see it as being an anti-Semitic body that brings, resolutions against the state of Israel, and those resolutions are extremely grim reading because I get to read them. Don't waste your time on it. But my view on that is, in that body, there are the very people you need to work with are all situated right there. They're all under one roof, all focused on one mission, which is education. And just because the political agenda gets hijacked by a small group of nations that have got a political vendetta against an even smaller nation, shouldn't stop the educational work that we're trying to do to improve accessibility to education and the values that go with it. And without doubt, some of the most powerful Holocaust and countering anti-Semitism programs are being funded by and driven by UNESCO, which is why we stay very invested in that, because that's where we can meet the people that we otherwise won't meet and won't talk to, including those from Arab nations.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and there's actually going to be, when we leave, they're going to reset this room, and we're going to have a survivor is going to be part of a discussion. So before, and we would encourage everyone, you still have time to, there's food and drinks in the back in the courtyard, and to visit Dimensions and Testimony, which is the room to the far there. Again, any other questions? I see we have extraordinary history teachers here, one of the best high school teachers. Yes?
Hi, I'm a graduate student in the enlightening program at USC, the School of Education, and I'll be entering the field within the next year in elementary schools. So I'm just curious, like, how can I access these eyewitness curriculum?
Yeah, so eyewitness...
Thank you for teeing that up to him.
Great. So eyewitness.usc.edu, if you're a teacher, prospective teacher, or even just pretending to be a teacher, you can log on and say you are a teacher, and you can be registered. So it's a straightforward registration process. Once you're on there, you'll get your own account and you can explore. But I would encourage you and everybody to come and visit us on the 4th floor of the Levy Library. We've got a fabulous team of people there that work on this all day, every day, and love to speak to prospective teachers. So please come and visit. And if you're a primary school teacher and you're interested in this, you're going to get extra love, because we have a team of people that are working specifically and focused on the primary education field right now. One exciting project which I'll be confirming, well, I already have confirmed, but we'll be getting going in December. Some of you might have seen the documentary by Dr. Ruth called Ask Dr. Ruth. If you haven't seen it, it's on Hulu, you'll find it. She's pushing this thing like crazy, and we'll see what happens. But in there's some really nice little animations. Whenever she's talking about her experience in Nazi Germany as a child, they go back to this sort of animation. So we've just agreed with her that we're going to be making a beautiful primary school program, extracting all them animations and making a little 12-minute short from those sequences, and then having the story of Dr. Ruth for primary schools for next year, and a bunch of other stuff. It's really exciting. So.
Time for a couple of more questions. Daphne and then Donna. And
I'm not sure. I'll end with a question mark, so that it'll be called a question.
Okay, great.
But it's a thing that I grapple with a lot, which is that there's a galvanizing power to hate.
Yeah.
And on the other side, there's a deeply stigmatizing stain of being the target of hate. And on the one hand, that's very universal, which is why it makes perfect sense that the foundation be looking for a variety of different genocidal activities to try and engage people. And on the other hand, there is something unique about hatred of Jews, which doesn't require the presence of actual Jews to be galvanizing or to be powerful. And I'm putting a question mark at the end because to me, when we're asking the question of why Jews, we actually do need to answer that question. It's bigger than just the galvanizing power of hate. So,
With the question mark.
To which the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I mean, to answer it fully would take a long answer, but I think you are raising something, and let's just leave it like that with the question mark and agree that's a really good statement to answer.
Yeah. Donna, and then we're going to close it up. And again, I encourage everyone to interact. We have extraordinary educators. Actually, Anna Ponce, one of the great educators in LA here, and others. This is about having a conversation about sharing the best tools that are out there for the kids and the students and the teachers. Donna?
I'll do a quick question. So, for all kinds of testimonies, you can see the sort of opponents after everyone's gone saying that we manipulated this, we made things up. You know, and particularly as I look at the spectacular technology of the hologram, you know, what's the answer for a new round of anti-Semites who will come up and somehow question the validity of actual testimony?
Well, we have one of them that's tracked us for many years. In fact, one of our most frequent users of the Visual History Archive is a Holocaust denier who uses testimony to turn it on the survivors themselves. It's very, very, yeah, I wish our students here at USC used the archive as much as he did. It would be fabulous. So we've been living there with that for quite a while in terms of how do you deal with that, particularly in an online world. And we had to make a decision. Do we let these testimonies, do we release them to the public or not? We made a decision that we would pilot that and we would test it and we would see what would happen. And the result of that is 9,999,999 of them do not abuse the archive and actually treat it with great respect. And then there's just a few out there that do not treat it with respect. As academicians, we have to look at testimony for what it is. I'll tell you a brief story. I'll try and keep it brief, I promise. About how I got into to thinking more deeply about this. And it happened actually with a Holocaust survivor I was working with 25 years ago. And I used to go to school with her, and she would tell her story. And I was the educator there to support her, and she would tell her story. And I noticed that she always cried at the same part in her story. She'd been in a detention center, she'd been on the train, she arrived at Auschwitz, she was in barracks, there was beatings, there was dysentery, there was gas chambers, no tears. And then she cries just at the sort of final element of her stay in Auschwitz, and then they leave on the death march. So I said, why do you cry at that point every time? She said, well, it was very simple. I was standing in a row of 5 girls, and she said, as you know, I found my sister. We'd been separated in Milan. We found each other in a barracks in Auschwitz-Birkenau a year later. So I had my sister, and without each other, we probably wouldn't have got through. I said, in the same row of 5 girls that I'm standing in, they were watching a hanging. And what had happened is 4 girls had been responsible for smuggling explosives into Auschwitz-Birkenau, and those explosives were used to destroy one of the gas chambers. An amazing act of resistance. October the 7th, 1944, one of the gas chambers was destroyed by the inmates of Auschwitz. A little-known story. 4 girls were responsible for smuggling in little bits of gunpowder every day to make the incendiary device. They were caught. 2 were being hanged in the morning, 2 in the evening. So she's standing watching the first hanging. She's next to her sister. And she said, and standing next to my sister was the sister of one of the girls being hanged. She said, that's the first thing. Second thing, she says, I had these glasses. She always had them. And these glasses are so important to me. I lose my glasses. I'm visually impaired. I'm blind. I'm clinically blind. They were hanging on with a piece of string at this point. She said, they knock into the mud, somebody stands on them. I'm not going to find my barracks. I'm gone. So I realize I'm no use in this place. And these 2 girls have blown up a gas chamber. So she said, all I wanted to do was put one foot in front of the other and say, take me. I'll swap places. She said, but I couldn't do it because I just wanted to live another day. And my heart was pounding, and I'm like, I've got to She said, and the third thing was the SS had a Christmas tree they put in the square right next to the gallows. It was the 6th of January, and it was still standing there. And she said, every time I think of that, I go, how dare you? She said, and the anger and the guilt and the sorrow and all that, it just comes gushing back. I said, okay, go back to the beginning of your story and tell me why you tell each episode that you tell. What I thought was a history of the Holocaust, of her history of the Holocaust, was nothing of the sort. It was a series of short stories, each of which has its own implicit meaning. It was about family and tenacity and friends and trust and resilience. And not a single word of it explicit in the testimony. But that's what it was there for. So that's when I started to say, okay, what is this really about? So I wrote a PhD about it, on about what is testimony really there for, what is it about? It's a really, really amazing, powerful lesson about life. It's not about history at all. What we have to do is develop the literacy among our users to understand the difference between fact and fiction, of which there is some, fact and fiction, but also how to get the power of the story to have meaning in our lives. And that's what we spend most of our time trying to do.
I think that's an appropriate way to end this discussion. But again, it's not the end of the discussion. This is an ongoing discussion. I want to thank Shoah. I see Colleen is here, and she is so wonderful. Liz, Beatrice, all the folks that helped make this possible. Kay and the Fisher Museum, we encourage you to stay here, to interact, keep the conversation going. Norbert, you've been drafted. You feel that now. You've been to do more. But this is so important. I thank all of you for sharing. And Stephen Smith, thank you, my friend.
Thank you.